Hello, I am Stephen Cobb, and this is my presentation on cybercrime as public health crisis. Deep harms, but big opportunities. First, let me provide some context. So the context for this presentation was the Tech Summit and Researchers Sync Up. This was in Dublin, in Ireland, in June, and it was put together by APWG. APWG is, as many people working in cybersecurity and cybercrime know, the Anti-Phishing Working Group. And this organization's been around for 20 years, trying to reduce and in the process track all of the phishing that goes on. Phishing being a crime that feeds many other cybercrimes. And so they do great work and they put on some great events. I'll give you details about the next big event coming up at the end of this talk. My talk, the talks at this event were not recorded because sometimes Chatham House rules are in play, but there are no such rules around this recording. You may share this freely if it is useful to you. Some context about myself. The scene you see before you is close to where I was born, in Coventry, in England. And from there, I went to university in Leeds and then graduate school in Canada, eventually ending up in America and somehow finding myself in computers. There I found the problem of security to be quite interesting and wrote a book about it. This was the first substantial book about security in the context of the personal computer in the local area network. It came out in 1992, and I was fortunate through that book to meet many of the pioneers of what is now cybersecurity as a business and as a discipline, as a profession. And some of us worked on a security startup together, which we sold, and then we founded a privacy startup, which we sold. And for the last 8 years of my working life, I worked for ESET, which is Europe's largest security software company, based in Bratislava, but I worked in San Diego, which is their American headquarters, where I had a small team of researchers not doing malware reversing, but looking at the implications of the malware and the vulnerabilities that other researchers at ESET were discovering, educating everyone from consumers to companies to governments on the implications of those discoveries. Let me share with you the thought process behind this talk. It starts out with cybercrime against individuals. In the form of digitally enabled fraud and scams. It keeps rising, and I'll explain later what that line is, but that's pretty much the shape of the increase in fraud and scams that are cyber enabled. So why aren't we doing more to counter this? I mean, we're doing a lot. There's a lot of money being spent by companies, by governments on trying to counter cybercrime. But obviously, at this point, it's not enough. Most countries, the reason for this, I think, is it's not a high enough priority. And one of the reasons for that is that maybe not enough people realize how much harm fraud and scams are causing. So why is that, and can we change it? Hopefully hopefully I will answer those questions with this presentation. So from that thought process emerged 5 factors. First, digitally enabled fraud and scams are rampant and rising. This is hurting people individually, as organizations, entire economies and societies. Reversing this trend is going to take more, better resources and effort than is currently applied to the problem, and we need to get better at persuading people to commit resources and make that effort. And I think demonstrating the scale and depth of the impact of digitally enabled fraud and scams could and should help. It's important to realize that even before computers, before cyber, fraud was under-policed relative to other crimes. One of the reasons for this is that there's no immediate physical harm from fraud, and people tend to think, after all, it's only money that's been lost. It's not like a limb has been lost or a life has been lost, although I might disagree with that later on. There's this sense also that victims are partially responsible. So, they weren't hurt physically. It's only money, and they were greedy, or they should not have fallen for that. And it's underreported. You can understand why when victim blaming is sort of in the picture. There's a sense of shame around this and a sense of hopelessness that you will get anything done as well. One of the reasons for that is that it's a complex and hard to investigate crime. Prosecuting it requires a lot of resources, specialized resources. And there's a quote here which kind of addresses that, in the sense that the National Crime Victimization Survey in America has traditionally not included financial fraud as a crime on which victims are surveyed. Fraud with cyber is, I would say, hugely underpoliced. We've got all the other things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then we have the added problem that perpetrators are remote. They're seen as untouchable, that there's not much law enforcement will be able to do about it, and the scale of fraud and attempted fraud can be, I said here almost, but talking to some of the people at the conference, it is overwhelming. One state in one country, I won't say which, actually went out and hired a professor of complexity to analyze the reports of fraud, particularly those around cryptocurrency. And his paper was very impressive. But we're talking about a professor of complexity needed to get a handle on the scale of fraud and attempted fraud going on at the moment. So fraud is at a crisis level. That's what survey respondents say. And in America, the American Association for Retired Persons surveyed people, not just old people, adult Americans, 2/3 of whom agreed that scams and seemingly constant scam attempts by phone, email, and text, all of which I would say are now digital, is at crisis level. And so scams and fraud are at a crisis level, but is it a public health crisis? We'll talk about that very soon. This is the results of the survey. Half the people thought that older adults are victimized by scams more often than younger adults. Yet 43% of adults 20 to 29 have actually lost money to fraud, compared to 23% of those aged 70 to 79. Kind of interesting, and when you get into the research behind the fraud epidemic, you see that there are misperceptions. Older people can be more susceptible, and older people have larger amounts of money to lose, yet young people are also susceptible too, and even though they might lose less money, it's still going to be, I think, a serious impact to them psychologically. Let's take a look at a metric that I think captures this trend in internet crime in the form of losses. So these are internet crime losses basically from scams and fraud, reported to the Internet Crime and Complaint Center, which is part of the FBI, going back to 2001 through to the most recent numbers in 2022. And I've written extensively about problems with cybercrime metrics, but I've read all of these reports, and this is what you get when you graph the annual loss figure, which is relatively consistently calculated over the years. By the way, none of the official reports contain this graph. I made it myself, but you can see it's just going up and up and up. And so I would say I'm confident that this is the shape of the financial impact of digitally enabled scams so far this century. The Anti-Phishing Working Group itself, APWG, shows that there's not much hope in the near future of this angle of attack, this growth spike slowing down. Phishing obviously is a major enabler of this kind of crime, and 2022 was a record year for phishing. And since the beginning of 2019, the number of phishing attacks has grown by more than 150% per year. So you can see there's not a lot of hope at this point that we've got a handle on this. Again, we need more resources devoted to the problem. There have been some fine countercrime policing efforts, and it's good to see people getting arrested. That's a big one in the UK. 100 people arrested at a go, shutting down a spoofing website, which was kind of the main tool used by scammers in the UK to do advanced push payment fraud, to call up from a bank and get people to move their money enabled by spoofing the bank's actual phone number. Spanish police take down massive cybercrime ring, 40 arrests there. And then a criminal marketplace taken down, again, hitting at the infrastructure of cybercrime and scams and frauds. But limited resources are clearly hampering efforts. In the UK, for example, fraud now accounts for 40%, sort of 41% of all crime against individuals. And most of it's online. So fraud is the most commonly experienced crime in the UK. And I won't read through Baroness Morgan of Coates' remarks, but basically, from the House of Lords on down through government, there's a growing awareness that this has to stop, and that if it was street crime, meat-space crime, as opposed to cyberspace online crime, then more would be done because people would be more outraged. More stats here. I won't go into detail reading these through. This talk was put together as part of a process in which I am writing a paper on the problem, and so I wanted to put more facts in there than we would go over in detail in the talk. But you can see, year ending March 2020, 4.5 million incidents of fraud. And we'll come back to that number later, but 61% cyber related. By the way, if you're doing work on crime statistics or any kind of statistics in the UK, bear in mind that some of it is by nation, not the entire UK. So the crime survey that is used here, mentioned here in following research that I'll cite, is for England and Wales. There has been pioneering work by cybersecurity researchers on non-financial impacts of internet fraud. So there's a paper which I would highly recommend from Modic and Anderson. It's all over but the crying, the emotional and financial impact of internet fraud. And they established fairly clearly, I think, that internet fraud's emotional impact is a major component of victimization, felt at least as strongly as the financial impacts. So, their recommendation, obviously, is that policymakers and other interested parties consider both elements when dealing with policies to deter fraud, and manage its aftermath, which is something I will come back to, the aftermath. But note this, participants consistently reported emotional impact as more severe than financial impact for all fraud types. And I'll show you this as a chart. You can see the red upper line is the emotional impact, and this is self-reporting from the participants. And you can see that, for example, advanced fee fraud, significantly, on the scale it's 7 for emotional impact, it's below 4 for financial impact. And this tracks with my experience personally and with friends and family and neighbors, which is one of the reasons that I've pursued this line of research and this line of inquiry, speaking to somebody who nearly lost thousands of pounds through a con conducted over the phone with a spoofed phone number and stolen personal data. Really hit that person emotionally. They suffered a loss of confidence. They had a good support from their friends and family and neighbors, but it was unpleasant, very, very unpleasant. And in some cases, this goes from unpleasant to downright damaging psychologically, requiring health intervention. So, something that can be done, and more research and study needs to be done on this, and more publication made about it, the link between the impact of online fraud and meat-based crime. So we have numbers. For example, in robbery in the UK, we know, average amount stolen resulting in average amount for health services, lost output and distress. These are figures cited by Modic and Anderson. That shows that, crime does have an impact well beyond and can be greater than the financial loss. And we'll see in a moment that the impact from digital scams and frauds can be equivalent to robbery, close to it. Okay, more quote there from Baroness Morgan. So, to make that link, we can look at research done in 2021 by Which. This is the name, Which with a question mark, is the name for the Consumers Association in the UK. And Symmetrica Jacobs is a research organisation, company that does research for governments and non-profits. Their paper, Scams and Subjective Wellbeing, Evidence from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, is really groundbreaking stuff, because it uses established policy-making tools, established social science methods to put some numbers on what impact scams can have. So, top line findings were that being a scam victim is associated with significantly lower levels of life satisfaction. That is a term of art which is defined in the literature. Lower levels of happiness, higher levels of anxiety. It's also associated with people self-reporting worse general health. And they make the case that applying standard evaluation techniques, it can be shown that these well-being harms extend well beyond estimates of financial loss. Here are two documents which are among the many documenting the concepts in this work: life satisfaction and subjective well-being, and the measurement of subjective well-being. This was developed to value non-market goods, including health outcomes, but put that in monetary terms. And those monetary terms are framed as the increase in annual income that would be required to rectify the situation. That might sound a little vague, but if you read the literature, it's a pretty well established methodology, and it's widely accepted in many countries when policy decisions are being made. So the findings are, in the first instance, a number, and this is a reduction or a growth number on a scale of 0 to 10. And you might think, well, these numbers are pretty low, but I'll put them in context in a moment. You'll see they're actually relatively high. So life satisfaction, down. Happiness, down. Worthwhileness, down. Anxiety, up. Now let's take a look at that in context. Using the same life satisfaction methodology, you can see that, if you're diagnosed with high blood pressure, that's 0.07. Suffering from asthma, 0.15. Meat-based crime, being threatened, 0.24. Experiencing theft, 0.26. Scam victimization, all forms, 0.168. Online fraud, 0.24. Almost up there with experiencing theft. And it was a significant finding that online fraud produced a greater reduction in life satisfaction than just fraud in general. And I've put up some of the math there behind this. The calculation was that valuing a decline in well-being came out to general fraud, 2,509 per year, online fraud 3,684 per year, significant numbers in general, but significantly greater for online fraud. So ADR is an organization which analyzes statistics in the UK, and their view of this report was that policymakers risk seriously underestimating the scale of harm if they do not focus on the psychological as well as financial consequences for victims. And there are some more notes from the literature there. This is a table showing how this plays out in terms of the number of incidents in that crime survey. Just a quick note on crime surveys. So one way of measuring the amount of crime is to look at the numbers of incidents reported to the police. But we know, or police and other authorities, we know that all crime is underreported, heavily underreported, in some cases, fraud being one of them. A survey is a way of getting a number that's more real. That is, you survey a large number, a representative number of households and people, and ask them about crime in a way that is non-threatening, and you're more likely to get a better picture of the extent of crime doing a survey. So 3.7 million with a valuation of 2509 is 9.3 billion. Now, the actual financial loss behind those is much, much lower. So here are some more quotes from that study. I won't read them all out. It's obviously clear that the non-financial impacts need to be taken at least as seriously as financial losses. I think a good case can be made for saying they're more serious and more far-reaching, long-lasting. And, you know, the relationship between being a scam victim and having much lower self-reported physical health was statistically significant. And obviously, there's a cost to individuals and society when physical health takes a hit. And if you multiply the numbers, it's certainly in scams and frauds, the hit can be very. So let's take a look at the numbers in some detail here. For context, I've provided the number of 21 billion, which is the annual social care spending across the UK. That's people in homes, people being cared for at home, and so on. And that's just for context. Now, let's look at the average financial loss per fraud incident. And in the survey used in this research by which, that's £600. The number of incidents in 21, 22, and by the way, again, for researchers, the Brits do a lot of their statistics on a financial year basis, which is April to March, 4.5 million. Multiply together, that's 2.7 billion in financial loss, which is a lot of money. You know, that's money out of the economy in a way. Obviously, if it's within country criminals, then, you know, it's recycling that money in the economy, but a lot of it leaves the country. And a lot of it is spent in non-untaxed ways, shall we say. So, what's the loss from social well-being? Well, for 21-22, 11.3 billion. Again, that's 1 year. And it's calculated by taking the number of incidents times those figures for well-being, impact, proportionalized around online or not online. 11.3 billion, and that is clearly more than 4x the financial loss. So that's, I think, worth looking at from a policy point of view, from a research point of view, from a cybersecurity point of view, from a counter-crime point of view. It's a big problem. It's hurting. It's, you know, a loss. If you take those two together, 14 billion coming from fraud, and the most of it being the impact that is not typically being measured or accounted for in policy discussions. So let's talk about policy and practical things that we can do. Here's a great example. There is a regional government, municipality in the UK called Dudley. Actually, some of my grandparents and great-grandparents are from Dudley. It's just north of Birmingham, England's second largest city. And they started a regional anti-scam campaign. There's about 320,000 people in that region. It was enabled by funding from the National Health Service. And that's because the National Health Service, with its Better Care Fund, does put money into projects that support people to live healthy, independent and dignified lives. There's this great idea which, you know, population health management people around the world, not just in the UK, but certainly in Europe and to some extent now in America, are looking at what's the total cost of our health and how can we reduce the causes of health problems. How can we produce a healthier society, one in which fewer people need health care, because health care is very expensive. And, you know, we have stop smoking, wear your seatbelt, stop speeding, and so on and so forth. An objective of that funding is to enable people to stay well, safe and independent at home for longer. Again, That saves both on healthcare and on social care. They started up in late 2017. They have so far saved £9 million from falling into the hands of financial criminals. In the last 12 months, it was £1 million. And that is clearly a win for the community. And I haven't seen numbers yet on how much healthcare savings, but we can assume it was quite a lot. Okay, so, and that was enabled by, in some ways, the research around harms from scams and frauds that are non-financial. Research in this area can lead to change. Age UK, Britain's equivalent of the AARP, it did research on the extent to which fraud impacts the elderly. That helped a successful campaign to make reimbursement for advance push payment fraud mandatory for older people in the UK. Which the organisation's research on social well-being was actually used in, again, successful lobbying for greater corporate responsibility. And the UK Parliament is now enacting a failure to prevent fraud offence to hold companies to account for fraud occurring on their systems and encourage better corporate behaviours. That legislation hasn't passed yet, but I'm pretty sure it will. And I think it's going to be quite a wake-up call to some of the large tech companies and platforms, certainly. So obviously I'm building up now to the opportunity side of this talk, which is the research opportunities that abound in this area. In quantifying the health impact of scams, particularly with reference to cybercrime, digitally enabled or enhanced crime. As a researcher, as either an individual or as an organization, results in this area, I think, can attract broad public attention and discussion. They can clearly lead to positive change, reflecting well on researchers and research sponsors, and a great help to policymakers and campaigners seeking to make beneficial changes in society. So we've got numbers already, but we need more in more detail. And I think they add up to, can add up, appropriately used in campaigning to make a difference. Just to expand on some of these points, I think for academic researchers or the researchers that some of the security software companies employ, non-profits perform research, look into the health impact of cybercrime, partner with charities, foundations. You can partner here, I think, outside of perhaps the normal realm of partnering you do for research. There are lots of opportunities here, I think, because, just to be clear, population health management, this idea that we can do things to reduce the number of people who get sick, is a very lively thread within policymaking at the moment, and I think you would find interest in a wide range of groups in working on this. Then publicize the results. This is much to the benefit of the researchers, the partners, campaigners, and society. Some of the research in the past didn't get as much exposure as it could have. But make sure that your results include calls for action. This could be recommendations for reducing impact. One of the things that you pick up on in looking at past research back before cyber, just fraud in general, research shows when you talk to victims, you find out what works and what doesn't work, perhaps, for helping victims get over their loss, not just their financial loss, but the psychological impact. And I think we need to do a lot more to inform victim support so that we can build better, stronger support mechanisms and resources for victims of fraud. until the day when we reduce fraud to a very manageable level, which hopefully won't be too far in the future. Look at different foci for your research. The elderly and certainly financial exploitation of the elderly has received a lot of attention. But what is the role of scams and online and cyber related scams and frauds with the elderly? Also the young, though. Young people are not immune to being cheated out of their money. Carers and caregivers is an interesting area that I've been involved in to some extent. I'll point out pioneering work by Stacey Woods, a psychologist in California. She's been using the term fraud crisis for a number of years and has written a lot about this in a public-facing way that's very helpful. And she has highlighted caregiving, which in the UK is called carers. Carers are caregivers. They look after people who are vulnerable, almost by definition. And so they can act as capable guardians, in criminological terms, for those people that they're looking after. But at the same time, being a caregiver or a carer makes you more vulnerable. You're distracted. You're working multiple roles in your life. And so I think it's an area where more attention is needed, and I'll be doing some work on that. And culturally, look, we are, I think, in many societies, failing to put out messages around crime and criminality and crime avoidance and security awareness in all the communities, in all of the parts of our community. So we need translations, we need culturally specific advice, and that's an interesting area, I think, that could be explored to great benefit to the researcher and to the victims. So other harm models. We've talked about subjective well-being. There is something called shattered assumptions theory, which is very interesting to look into. And what's the impact on the economy, on productivity? And so I'll leave those suggestions with you. Bonus, if you're in America or want to research Americans, the US privacy legislation and case law has a very cold-hearted approach to the idea of harm. So what we've seen is that courts in America consistently rule that when there's a data breach, you haven't, as a person whose data has been exposed, suffered any harm unless you can show dollars and cents on that harm, right? And the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, has ruled emotional distress alone cannot amount to actual damages under the Privacy Act of 1974. By the way, Privacy Act of 1974 and how that came to be, fascinating story. It was going to be a privacy law for all Americans, covering companies as well as the government. It ended up being just for the federal government, and there were going to be actual damages in it, but again, they were taken out before it was passed. Anyway, I think research that can put a solid number on emotional distress and those factors that we've been talking about, well-being, anxiety, life satisfaction, puts numbers on that and gets together with a good team of lawyers, you could make a huge difference if you've got a landmark decision there that yes, there are damages, they are actual, and they're to my well-being. Okay, 3 sort of final assertions. Just a reminder, cybercrimes like phishing, fraud and scams hurt people in ways that have serious implications for public health policy. Targeted spending on cybercrime prevention and response can be justified as a public health measure. And reducing digitally enabled crimes against individuals should be part of every nation's population health management, policy, strategy, and budget. That includes funds to research, develop, and implement novel interdisciplinary approaches to reducing cybercrime and its impact on people, both at the time of victimization and thereafter. And with that, I thank you very much. I'd also like to thank APWG.EU for inviting me to speak at what was a very, very educational event. And I would seriously recommend you consider eCrime 2023 in November in Barcelona. Consider sponsoring it, consider speaking at it, consider going to it. I always come away from APWG events with a lot of understanding, a lot of thoughts to think about, a lot of ideas, and a lot of new friends. So look up apwg.org and apwg.eu. If you need more about me, I have a link tree. I am Scob at scob.net if you have questions. I hope you found this recording to be useful, and feel free to share it if you think it would be useful to others. Thank you very much.